If you haven't seen the previous video, check it out on my channel. In summary, these are some policy recommendations that I believe will improve the standard of living across Canada. Number 13. Mandatory body cams on police officers. Most police cams are positioned near the chest pocket or collar currently, and usually have a button the officer can press to turn off the audio or video or both. I think instead of a button it should be a 6-digit code. Something that couldn't possibly be done by accident during a scuffle, so if the camera is turned off during a confrontation with civilians, then it would be considered tampering with evidence and the officer would be held liable. The 6-digit code still allows them privacy for bathroom breaks. Video footage should be archived for at least 7 years. Number 14. Legalize all recreational drugs. People must be 25 or older to purchase or use. Expunge all drug-related charges and release anyone currently being held on drug charges. For anyone held because of drug charges since 2000, pay them or next of kin an amount equal to full-time minimum wage for the duration of their sentence, according to federal minimum wage and full-time definition in the years they were imprisoned. Operating vehicles or other heavy machinery while under the influence will still be illegal based on existing marijuana and alcohol laws. Distributing to minors will still be illegal under existing laws, although I would also like to up the age for alcohol and marijuana to 25 bundled with this legalization. Number 15. For any abandoned towns or villages which are not in high-risk natural disaster areas, offer the land for free to any person or group willing and able to demolish and rebuild, with preference given to native groups. Building inspections can be held. If the building is safe to live in, it can stay standing. Once 100 homes are deemed livable the location, the government begins repairing electricity, water, sewage, if applicable, roads, with the goal of having the place operational by the time 1,000 people live there. Note, this means for the first settlers, they will need septic tanks, well water or bottled water, and their own electricity generators. These requirements can be skipped on a case-by-case basis if the community is expected to repopulate rapidly. I mentioned something similar in my last video targeting individual abandoned properties, which would have much more of the cost paid for by the government. That was targeting buildings in already populated areas. This is targeting locations which could eventually become new municipalities. Number 16. Rental websites should be held liable for scheduling building inspections of all rentals posted, before the posting becomes public, with the inspections paid for by the landlord to be. So many housing rental websites operate like Facebook and Kijiji with no regulatory oversight, and so many rental units are already illegal, but the laws aren't being enforced. If there is no second exit in case of fire, it is already illegal, but most basement apartments in Canada don't have a fire exit. I'm not sure if there are any laws concerning range hoods or ventilation, but from experience I tell you I will never again live with a place where the kitchen does not have a range hood or window. If rental websites were held liable, then they would be stricter on which apartments can be posted, otherwise the whole website might get taken down by hefty fines. And sites like Facebook and Kijiji wouldn't want to handle that overhead, so they would likely stop allowing rental property listings. Number 17. Free public transit. The amount of time and money wasted trying to enforce payment with loose change on buses, or building new entryways to subway stations to prevent people from hopping over the pay stations is ridiculous. People taking public transit, I think, fall into two groups. Those who do it because they can't afford a vehicle, in which case we shouldn't be giving them a tax on being poor in the form of public transit fees. And those who live in crowded enough places that it is more convenient to take public transit, in which case we shouldn't be slowing down the flow of passengers and departure of transit vehicles by stopping every person to ask for payment. According to the Toronto Transit Commission, nearly 1 million people use their transit system every day. If each one is losing 2 seconds paying, that is a combined 23 days worth of delays in transit times every day. How much paper is wasted on transfer tickets each day? How much money is spent accounting for those transit fees? And what about the people who don't live in the Greater Toronto Area? Around 15% of Canadians live in rural areas. Are we spending 15% of the public transit budget on rural areas? The millions of dollars spent on highways and overpasses, which degrade over time, could transport more people if spent on trains, subways, and other forms of public transit. Instead of being large lump sums of expense every year on repaving roads, and every decade or so replacing concrete on highways and bridges, it could be a more evenly split expense on train operation, staffing, and maintenance. Number 18. Gambling in video games is gambling. Enforce the same age limits. I think things like the games ratings and movie ratings should be done by an external organization, with clear and objective metrics. Everyone is familiar with the 1 F-word limit in PG-13 movies, but what's the difference between G and PG? What's the difference between R and 18A? On paper it is the difference between a 17-year-old needing an 18-year-old with them to enter a movie, but in practice I've never seen this enforced at any theater. What's the difference between T for teen and M for mature video games? The trope of 12-year-olds shouting the N-word and other obscenities on Call of Duty has been a mainstay in gaming memes for over 20 years now, and no one has been successful in getting the children off of the rated M game. The discussion of what should or shouldn't be put into the different age ranges is ongoing, but I think we can all agree that people who are banned from gambling in casinos should also be banned from gambling in digital casinos. If you can't play poker in real life, you shouldn't be playing it in Red Dead Redemption. Growing up, I always found it weird that American movies would censor nudity but allow violence, while European movies would censor violence and allow nudity. I personally side more on the European end of that spectrum, but I would prefer this sort of thing be voted on rather than the opinion of one or a small group of people dictating their preferences to the entire country. I think that murder simulators like Call of Duty are a healthy outlet for angry young people, and I believe there are good quality statistics linking increased porn usage in third world countries to decreased sexual assault rates. I'd appreciate a government organization doing a meta-analysis of the studies that have already been done, and identifying any gaps in research, or if there are none, using the meta-analysis to inform policy. If the consensus of research comes back and says gambling for 3-year-olds is safe and doesn't have any negative effect on them or their families, then I'd be willing to concede defeat. However, I think that existing research has already shown the exact opposite. Exposing children to random rewards for repetitive processes permanently damages them mentally. To round up this topic, I know it is common for out-of-touch adults to pick up M-rated video games for their nieces and nephews, and I want that to stop. If they were doing that with cigarettes or alcohol, they would be publicly shamed and maybe even prosecuted. For no reason at all, we seem to have an exception for allowing children to participate in gambling, or view car crashes. Number 19. Land left vacant within municipal borders for more than 5 years shall be forfeited to the city and converted into public spaces such as parks, bus stations, homeless shelters, libraries, etc., according to what is reasonable for that municipality. There are far too many construction companies that just sit on vacant land for 20 years before building on it so they can make 1,000% profit on the land and not have to worry about their actual construction costs. This is especially bad near high population centers since that land is preventing housing from being built and driving up rental prices through low supply highway robbery. In rural locations, vacant land is sometimes taken back by nature, but sometimes it just sits there barren. Habitats destroyed, forests bulldozed, water reservoirs polluted with oil and rust and other debris which would be cleaned up during normal construction to allow for the sale or occupation of new buildings, but gets left there for years when construction is halted. Number 20. Expand recycling programs to be standardized across Canada, so all recyclable material is recyclable in all population centers above 1,000 residents. If that means sorting and storing different material types in smaller population centers for years or decades before it is large enough to be processed at a large plant far away, so be it, but we should not be putting that stuff in landfills. Number 21. Ban the import, manufacture, and use of non-recyclable, non-reusable plastics. This includes multi-layer materials like chip bags, as well as non-recyclable casings on electronics. I think I would put in an exemption for anything made from 100% post-consumer recycled material until 2050, even if it is not recyclable itself. Number 22. Nationalize the healthcare system. Health insurance shouldn't exist, no one should have to pay for prescription medication or surgery. Paramedical specialists such as dentistry, physiotherapy, orthodontics, prenatal assistance, and birth control should all be considered part of healthcare. Medical research, manufacturing medical isotopes, and developing new vaccines and medications should be handled within a federal system rather than by private corporations. I think nationalizing the existing hospitals, clinics, and provincial systems could happen in a year or two. Then include specialists and paramedical services by 2030. As more services become nationalized and free for use, the health insurance industry would shrink, and staff from that industry would be retrained to work in the nationalized system if they chose to. By 2035, I think we could bring in pharmaceutical manufacturing and vaccine research and development. I would also try to get mental health services included by 2040, and include therapy and counseling by 2045. I think I'd leave dietitians, personal trainers, and massage therapists for last, around 2050, since their industries are very personalized and there are competing methodologies which would need to be reviewed and possibly standardized. You wouldn't want the same dietitian recommending both the high-fat diet and the low-fat diet to you, and you wouldn't want a massage therapist suggesting something that contradicts what a surgeon told you for recovery. Once they are all part of a nationalized system, they will all have access to your health record and be able to make better informed decisions. Number 23. Declare Internet a public utility in Canada. Internet access was already declared a human right by the United Nations in 2016, but much like food, water, and shelter, minimal effort has been made to provide this human right to all humans. I think the Canadian government should have a public internet service provider which can serve as a default competitor to private sector providers. Number 24. Any corporations using slave or forced labor should be shut down, liquidated, and the money used to pay reparations. If an individual was kidnapping people and enslaving them to pick produce, and making a huge profit off that produce, they would be arrested and the money would be taken away. I don't see why we're more lenient with corporations than we are with humans. Criminal investigations should be held to uncover who at the company knew about it or had a decision in it and give them each 1 year jail time or community service. That may not seem like much, but imagine if every executive and warehouse manager at Amazon was in jail for an entire year, at the same time that all of Amazon's Canadian warehouses and delivery services were shut down and liquidated to pay their former employees. Number 25. Remove the statute of limitations on murder. If they killed someone 80 years ago when they were a teenager and are now in their late 90s, then they basically got away with it, but I think the current limit is something like 15 years. If someone was murdered in 2005 and we catch the killer today, then I don't see why they should be immune from prosecution. Even if that just means some mandatory therapy and community service work picking up garbage on the side of the road. Number 26. Shorting stocks should be illegal. If I can't sell a chair that I don't have, then you can't sell a stock that you don't have. Moreover, the entire stock market should be classified as a for-profit casino. Any retirement funds or pension plans or other institutional assets should be refunded by the stock market immediately. Whoever owns stocks of Royal Bank of Canada should be given the cash equivalent of the current market value of those stocks paid for by the Royal Bank of Canada. There is a canyon of difference between donating money to a business that you want to see succeed versus loaning money to a massive corporation and expecting them to pay you back with interest. People should be free to donate money to whichever businesses they want, but those should be classified as gifts, not loans. That way, businesses can invest their profits back into paying their workers and improving their services instead of paying their investors. The whole idea of lending money and expecting it to be paid back with interest is based on the assumption that whoever you are lending to is going to scam someone else out of money above and beyond their costs. If I loaned you $1 to buy some fruit from the grocery store and you then sold that fruit for double the price at a roadside stand, took 50 cents for yourself and gave me back $1.50, then any passerby would think I scammed you, and you scammed the people who bought the fruit from you. Neither of us produced any valuable products or services with that money, the customer paid extra for no benefit to them. Number 27. Implement a national basic income which will be 50% of full-time minimum wage, available to all residents of Canada. This should be enough to cover human rights such as housing, food, water, heating during the winter, electricity, internet, cooling during the summer, clothing, and medicine. In one of my earlier recommendations, I stated that rent should be no more than a quarter of minimum wage full-time. This national basic income will more than pay for that. I would have to do some math to see if those other things add up to more than the rest of this basic income. I think starting small and ramping up is a good strategy for something like this. If my earlier policy of a massive increase to minimum wage and a rental price freeze were in place, I would probably wait to implement this to coincide with the end of that rental freeze. If my earlier recommendation about nationalizing healthcare and creating a public internet service provider comes into effect before this one, then those services would be provided at no cost, so it would help the basic income to cover the remaining costs. Once the economy adjusts to the national basic income, which I'm guessing will take at least 3 years, I'd like to increase the national basic income to be equal to minimum wage, which is still tied to inflation. Number 28. Replace Canada's current rail system, cross-country trucking industry, and public transit infrastructure with maglev trains. As mentioned previously, trains require significantly less maintenance than concrete or asphalt roads coupled with diesel or gasoline engines. This would be a big investment laying the tracks, but I think it would be worth it. The track laying could also function as a government jobs program for current workers in those industries as they transition out. Laying the tracks wouldn't happen overnight, so it would allow for retraining groups of employees as their individual old rail or bus locations are replaced with maglev trains. Number 29. Safely haul all oil extraction in Canada, and replace all current coal and diesel electricity with renewable sources such as tidal, geothermal, wind, solar, hydroelectric, and more as they are discovered. Meanwhile, replace gas stations with electric charging stations. Start with 50-50 and transition toward only electric stations. There are already movements in place to ban the manufacture and import of gasoline and diesel vehicles, and I think within 20 years there will be a government buyback program to get any existing ones off the road. Stopping oil extraction and decommissioning gas stations would have to be managed during or after the replacement of the trucking industry with electric trains. Canada has already banned some single-use plastics, and my earlier recommendation doubling down on that would ensure oil extraction is not needed for manufacturing either. Number 30. Implement a fine on businesses who have more than 10% of their workforce commute from more than 10 kilometers away. I would include exemptions for jobs that require outdoor work or whose job cannot be done without travel. This should encourage businesses to hire locally, reduce the traffic congestion and the strain on public transit, and encourage work from home for any jobs that can be done effectively from remote locations. I hope that moving 15 to 45% of the workforce to remote work has three knock-on effects. The first is more lucrative job opportunities for people living in rural locations or remote locations such as the territories, small villages, and current native reserves. The second is with less demand for in-person jobs in large cities, the population will spread out more, repopulating some of those ghost towns I mentioned in a previous recommendation, as well as new locations that aren't currently residential, thus leading to lower population density in cities and lower rent prices as landlords compete for tenants. The third is reduced carbon emissions from traffic jams in large cities, which should decrease the carbon parts per million in cities, which I've read will lead directly to reduced stress and increased intelligence among people who grow up there. Number 31. Replace the current sales tax system with more targeted sales tax on specific things. This would include a 50% tax on drinkable sugar, 25% tax on edible sugar, 100% tax on alcohol and recreational drugs, 50% tax on red meat, 25% tax on non-biodegradable packaging, and other products to be determined by referendum or vote. We already have plenty of things that are tax-exempt, such as vegetables and bread, but I don't like the provinces getting to decide their own sales tax separate from the federal sales tax, and if we're using taxes to discourage certain purchases, then I think 15% is too low. I know sales tax is still a regressive tax that impacts the poor more than the wealthy, but this is a stopgap measure intended to be removed as the economy transitions away from capitalism. Number 32. Replace cow farms with smaller livestock or with crops or with meat cultivation labs over the course of 20 years. The goal is to reduce carbon emissions and reduce unnecessary animal suffering. Number 33. Implement an import tariff on products that are controlled in Canada: coal, gas, sugar, cow products, non-electric vehicles. Default to 100% tariff to coincide with earlier recommendations and current practices from 2024. Number 34. Create and teach a new food pyramid that has fruits and vegetables as the largest section, based on health experts, and schedule it to be revamped every 20 years based on new research and discoveries. This would be implemented after dietitians are included in the Canadian nationalized healthcare system. I'm hoping by then there will be more agreement on which foods are healthy in which proportions. The current food pyramid with grain as the base is known to be unhealthy for most humans. Broadly speaking, vegetables are agreed to be the healthiest human food. There is ongoing debate about fruits, if they are too sugary or if the nutrients they provide offsets that. Starches, whole grains, fish, eggs, and poultry are also debated. Red wine and red meat occasionally pop up in magazines as quote-unquote healthy, but I don't think any serious and honest dietitians or physicians believe that. Number 35. Create a government-owned grocery store chain. Only foods in the new food pyramid's recommended diet are stocked. All stock is free to customers, no checkout needed. Store staff will still be there to clean and stock shelves and manage repairs and maintenance. This should eliminate the need for the older food banks and food donation drives. I'm not sure if places like these would need some sort of barcode inventory system to ensure they stay stocked, or if that would be wasted labor. I would probably consult with the existing food banks and vaccination centers to see what they do and how their process could work with the more choice-driven process of grocery stores. Maybe there could be a scanner on the shelf so as something is stocked it counts up and as something is taken off it counts down, almost like a scale. I might be overthinking this. Number 36. Expand the Reduce Reuse Recycle program. For example, I would replace glitter in school arts and crafts with a biodegradable alternative. I would also emphasize the reuse portion more heavily and include it as mandatory curriculum in either middle school or high school. This would build on my earlier recommendation of standardizing which materials can be recycled nationwide, and I would like to couple the education changes with an expansion of recycling facilities across all provinces and territories to cover a broader scope of materials. I would also take this time to re-evaluate the sales taxes on non-biodegradable packaging and the fines and bans on non-recyclable materials. Obviously, if a previously non-recyclable material becomes recyclable, then we don't need to ban it anymore unless there was another reason for the ban. Number 37. Nationalize the electrical grid. We already consider it a human right, so no one should be profiting off it. Number 38. Reform the education system to focus on critical thinking and research rather than memorization. We've been in a post-truth world for nearly a decade now. It is difficult if not impossible to tell which reviews are humans and which are bots. Which things are remixes or reposts or modified reposts or taken out of context or video editing versus real life. Deepfakes, AI art, and AI writing is only going to get better as time goes on. We need a populace who can find the nuggets of truth among the mountains of lies on the internet. Teaching the scientific method of testing is far more important than teaching specific scientific facts. Teaching how to multiply is far more important than memorizing multiplication tables. Teaching how to read and read between the lines is far more important than teaching different historical poems or historical books. I like how cursive was already taken out of the curriculum and typing is being taught at younger ages now than it was 20 years ago. But I think we need bigger steps than that. That's all I have for now, but there are probably hundreds more topics which could be addressed to improve the quality of life for Canadians. I barely mentioned discrimination, reparations, gender, sexuality, natural disaster relief, nepotism, generational trauma, or dismantling capitalism. If someone were to create a list of grievances or social ills, that would give me a good starting point to make recommendations to minimize or eliminate them.